There is a wound in the heart of America that never healed. It sits beneath the desert sun in Washington State, silent and patient. We built our salvation there during the war, and in doing so, we poisoned the ground for longer than civilizations survive. The cost of our survival burns still, invisible in soil that will outlive every memory of why we did what we did. In the spring of 1943, the world was burning. Nazi Germany raced toward a weapon that could end all wars, all nations, all hope. We could not let them win that race. So in the absolute secrecy that only terror allows, the United States government assembled the greatest scientific minds the free world had ever known and gave them one impossible task: build the bomb before Hitler does. The Manhattan Project was born not from ambition, but from the raw animal fear of annihilation. It was desperation dressed in lab coats and military uniforms. They needed a place far from the cities, far from the eyes of German spies, far from anywhere that mattered to anyone. They found it along the Columbia River in south-central Washington, a sweep of desert and sagebrush where only jackrabbits and rattlesnakes had laid claim. The government looked at that emptiness and saw possibility. In 1943, they erased entire communities from the map. The towns of Hanford Site, Bluffs, and Richland were given weeks to pack their lives into trucks and disappear. Farmers who had worked that soil for generations watched as soldiers with rifles told them their land now belonged to the war effort. 1,500 residents were displaced in a matter of months. No appeals, no negotiations, just go. Families left behind orchards heavy with fruit they would never harvest. They abandoned homes where children had been born and grandparents had died. The government paid them what it decided was fair, which is to say, not nearly enough, and bulldozed their memories into the dust. Streets where neighbors had greeted each other for decades became restricted zones guarded by men with guns. The post office, the schoolhouse, the general store, all of it vanished as though it had never existed. In their place rose something that belonged to the future, and the future alone. What rose from that forced exodus was something the world had never seen. They called it the Hanford Site. But it was more than a site. It was an industrial cathedral to the atom, a sprawling complex of reactors and separation plants and miles of underground pipelines carrying liquids that glowed with the fire of creation itself. The facility eventually covered 586 square miles of desert, an area larger than the city of Los Angeles. The mission was singular and terrifying in its simplicity. Produce plutonium. Produce it faster and in greater quantities than anyone thought possible. Plutonium-239, the nightmare isotope, the heart of the atomic bomb. The first reactor, known simply as B-reactor, went critical in September of 1944. It was the first full-scale plutonium production reactor ever built by human hands. Inside that massive concrete shell, uranium fuel rods were bombarded with neutrons, and through the alchemy of fission, plutonium was born. The reactor measured 46 feet high, 36 feet wide, and 28 feet long. Workers stood outside that reactor and felt the heat radiating through walls thick enough to stop a freight train. They did not fully understand what they were creating. They only knew it mattered more than their own lives. The Columbia River became the lifeblood of the atomic machine. Every second, 75,000 gallons of river water were pumped through the reactors to cool the uranium fuel rods. The water entered cold and emerged heated, laden with radioactive isotopes that had never existed in nature before human hands forced them into being. That water flowed back into the Columbia, carrying its invisible cargo downstream toward communities who fished those waters and irrigated their crops with what they believed was clean snowmelt from the Cascade Mountains. Nobody told them what was in the water. Nobody thought they needed to know. By the time the war ended, Hanford operated 9 nuclear reactors along the Columbia River. 9 beating hearts of plutonium production. The scale was beyond comprehension. 56 million gallons of radioactive and chemical waste were generated in the pursuit of enough plutonium to end the war. That waste had to go somewhere. They built 177 underground storage tanks, massive steel and concrete vessels buried beneath the desert floor. Some tanks held 1 million gallons each. Into those tanks, they poured the liquid remains of our atomic ambition. High-level waste, caustic and boiling, waste so radioactive it generated its own heat for decades. The workers came by the tens of thousands. At its peak, the Hanford Site employed more than 51,000 people who lived in the newly built city of Richland. They were patriots, every one of them. They worked in secrecy so complete that even husbands and wives could not speak about what happened inside the fences. Security badges color-coded by clearance level determined who could enter which buildings. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter day and night. Anyone caught discussing their work faced immediate dismissal and possible prosecution. They worked 12-hour shifts in buildings designated only by letters and numbers. The T plant, the U plant, the Purex facility, each one a factory for separating plutonium from irradiated uranium fuel rods using a chemical process so complex and so dangerous that workers operated behind thick leaded glass windows using mechanical arms. They breathed air laced with invisible particles. They drank water from the Columbia River downstream from the reactors. They raised children in the shadow of something they could not see or smell or taste, but that was rewriting their cells with every breath. The plutonium separation process produced waste that defied imagination. Nitric acid, sodium hydroxide, ferrocyanide compounds mixed with fission products like cesium and strontium. The chemical soups were so caustic they ate through steel. So hot they boiled for years inside those underground tanks. Workers sometimes heard the tanks groan and shift as the waste inside expanded and contracted with temperature changes. It sounded like the earth itself complaining about what we had buried in its belly. Most of them did not know what they were building until August 6, 1945. That morning, the world learned what happened when you split the atom over a city. Hiroshima became a word that meant the end of one age and the beginning of another. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. The plutonium in the bomb that destroyed Nagasaki came from Hanford. It was made in those reactors along the Columbia by workers who believed they were saving the world. And perhaps they were, but the cost of that salvation would echo for generations. The war ended, but Hanford did not stop. The Cold War demanded more plutonium, always more. The reactors ran hot through the 1950s and 60s. Additional reactors came online. The N reactor, largest of them all, produced both plutonium and electricity simultaneously. It operated until 1987. The pace was relentless. Between 1944 and 1989, Hanford produced 67 metric tons of plutonium, enough for more than 60,000 nuclear warheads. 60,000. Let that number settle in your mind. 60,000 ways to end the world, all of them born in the desert along the Columbia River. And then, slowly, the truth began to surface like oil seeping through cracks in the earth. The tanks were leaking. Not one or two, but dozens of them. 67 tanks confirmed leaking by the 1990s. High-level radioactive waste was escaping into the soil, migrating toward the Columbia River, moving through underground aquifers toward communities downstream who had no idea they were living on borrowed time. One tank alone, designated T-106, leaked an estimated 115,000 gallons before anyone noticed. 115,000 gallons of liquid, fire seeping into the earth. And that was just one tank. In 1986, the last production reactor at Hanford shut down forever. The Cold War was thawing. We did not need as many warheads as we once thought we did. the site that had produced 2/3 of the plutonium in the entire United States nuclear arsenal, fell silent. What remained was the largest environmental cleanup project in the history of the Western Hemisphere. A mess so vast and so poisonous that estimates put the cost of cleaning it at more than $677 billion over the next 75 years. $677 billion, more than the entire gross domestic product of some nations. Walk the Hanford Site today, and you will see a landscape frozen in radioactive amber. Buildings stand empty, their windows dark, their hallways filled with contamination levels that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. The B reactor, the first of its kind, is now a museum. You can tour it with a guide and stand in the same control room where operators watched gauges and pulled levers that changed history. But you cannot stay long. Even decommissioned, even decades cold, the reactor still whispers with radiation. The waste remains. 56 million gallons of it, much of it still underground in those aging tanks. Some of the tanks have leaked more than 1 million gallons into the soil. Cesium-137, strontium-90, plutonium-239, americium-241, technetium-99. A periodic table of poisons that will remain dangerous for more than 10,000 years. The contaminated groundwater plume beneath Hanford covers approximately 87 square miles and continues to move toward the Columbia River at a rate of several feet per year. Several feet per year. Slow but inevitable, like a cancer spreading through the body of the earth. How do you clean up a catastrophe that outlasts empires? The Hanford workers who built the bomb and won the war paid with their bodies. Thyroid disease, cancer, autoimmune disorders, birth defects in their children. For decades, they were told there was no danger, that the radiation releases were minimal, that their symptoms had nothing to do with their work. Declassified documents later revealed the truth. Between 1944 and 1972, Hanford released millions of curies of radioactive material into the air and water. The Green Run experiment in December of 1949 deliberately released approximately 8,000 curies of radioactive iodine-131 to test monitoring equipment. Nobody told the downwind communities. Nobody warned the mothers nursing babies or the children playing in the Columbia River. They were test subjects who never consented to the experiment. The betrayal is the hardest part to reconcile. These were people who trusted their government absolutely. They worked in silence because they were told it was necessary. They sacrificed their health because they believed in something larger than themselves. And when they got sick, when their children got sick, they were met with denial and bureaucracy and stonewalling that lasted decades. The Hanford Downwinders, they call themselves now. Communities downwind of the site who were showered with invisible poison and then told it was all in their heads. It took lawsuits and congressional hearings and whistleblowers before the government admitted what had been done. Some of the workers never lived to see that admission. They died still believing they had done something wrong, that their cancers were their own fault somehow. There is something deeply American about Hanford. The ambition of it, the secrecy, the willingness to sacrifice everything for victory. We transformed a desert into the beating heart of the nuclear age in less than 2 years. We produced weapons that ended the deadliest war in human history. But there is also something tragic in what we left behind. We built a weapon to save civilization, and in the process, we created a wound in the earth that will outlive our nation. The Columbia River still flows past those reactors, carrying trace amounts of tritium and other isotopes downstream. The desert wind still blows across those burial grounds of radioactive waste, and beneath it all, the plutonium waits with the patience of eternity. The cleanup continues. Engineers and scientists work every day to vitrify the waste, to turn liquid poison into glass logs that can be stored for millennia. The waste treatment plant under construction at Hanford is designed to treat millions of gallons through a process called vitrification, mixing the waste with molten glass at temperatures exceeding 2,100 degrees Fahrenheit. It is noble work and necessary work, but it is also Sisyphean. For every tank they empty, the contamination in the soil remains. For every building they demolish, the radiation lingers in the concrete. Dust. The half-life of plutonium-239 is 24,100 years. Human civilization is barely older than that. Think about that. The pyramids of Egypt are less than 5,000 years old. The entire span of recorded human history would need to repeat itself nearly 5 times before that plutonium becomes half as dangerous as it is today. There are fences around Hanford now, miles and miles of them. Warning signs in multiple languages. Radiation trefoils, the international symbol of invisible danger. Future generations will inherit this place, and they will have to decide what to do with it. How do you warn the future about the mistakes of the past when every civilization eventually crumbles into dust? Linguists and anthropologists have proposed warning markers that rely on universal human responses. Landscapes of thorns, fields of spikes, black absorbing stone that makes the land look cursed even from a distance. But even these may fail. Curiosity is a powerful human instinct. If future generations see the warnings and dig anyway, the consequences will be unimaginable. The ghost of Hanford is the ghost of our own power turned against us. We reached for the fire of the gods, and we got it. We ended the war and saved millions of lives that would have been lost in an invasion of Japan. But we also unleashed something we cannot put back. The genie will not return to the bottle. The atoms will not reassemble themselves into stable elements. The poison will not evaporate. It will only wait, buried in the desert, glowing faintly in the dark. This is the bargain we made. This is the price of the atomic age. We are all downwinders now, living in the long shadow of decisions made in desperation and fear. The question is not whether Hanford was necessary. The question is whether we have the courage to face what we created and the wisdom to ensure we never need to create it again. The desert remembers everything. The soil holds every secret. And the ghost of Hanford will outlive us all, patient and invisible, waiting for a future we can barely imagine. Did you grow up doing shelter drills under your school desk? The atomic ghost touches all of us whether we know it or not. Its legacy is written in the soil, in the water, in the bodies of those who built the bomb and those who lived in its shadow. We owe them the truth. We owe the future our vigilance. The fire we kindled in the desert still burns. Share your story in the comments. We want to hear from you.